At 4:06 a.m., deep beneath the frozen soil of Greenland, a U.S. Air Force technician froze in place. The instrument panel in front of him had just registered a signal that made no sense. The object was too fast to be an aircraft, too slow to be a missile, and appeared briefly inside restricted airspace without crossing any perimeter. Before he could call it in, the signal vanished. The technician did what protocol demanded. He logged the anomaly. Then he did what survival demanded. He said nothing more. This incident never reached the newspapers. It never reached Congress. It barely reached the Pentagon. Yet it marked the beginning of one of the most closely guarded chapters of the Cold War, an era when the United States realized that its greatest vulnerability was not Soviet weapons, but uncertainty itself. By the late 1940s, the world had split in two. On one side stood the United States and its allies, armed with atomic power and technological confidence. On the other stood the Soviet Union, secretive, relentless, and expanding its influence. Every radar blip mattered. Every radio signal was suspect. Every unexplained event carried the weight of potential annihilation. The Cold War was not just a battle of ideologies. It was a war of perception. And perception could be broken. In 1947, the U.S. military began noticing a pattern, quiet at first, easily dismissed. Radar operators reported unidentified returns that did not match known aircraft profiles. Pilots described objects that appeared suddenly, maneuvered impossibly, then vanished. Naval crews logged sonar contacts that moved against currents, then disappeared into silence. Each report was investigated individually. Each was explained away. Collectively, they told a different story. The U.S. Air Force, newly independent in 1947, was tasked with defending American airspace against Soviet bombers. Early warning systems were crude, but expanded rapidly. Radar chains stretched across the continent. Observation posts dotted coastlines. The sky was under constant watch. Yet something kept slipping through. In January 1948, Captain Thomas Mantell, a decorated World War II pilot, was ordered to intercept an unidentified object over Kentucky. Ground observers described it as metallic and reflective. Mantell climbed aggressively in pursuit. His aircraft exceeded safe altitude limits. Moments later, he lost consciousness. His plane spiraled into the ground. The official explanation blamed oxygen failure. Privately, Air Force investigators were disturbed. Radar data did not align with visual reports. The object Mantell chased did not behave like any known aircraft. The case was closed publicly, but internally flagged. More incidents followed. In 1952, radar operators at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base tracked multiple unidentified objects over the nation's capital. The targets appeared, disappeared, and reappeared at will. Fighter jets were scrambled. Pilots reported seeing lights that accelerated beyond interception range. President Harry Truman was informed. The explanation given to the public was temperature inversion, a rare atmospheric condition that could cause false radar retracts. But temperature inversions do not pace fighter jets. Behind closed doors, the Air Force convened emergency meetings. Analysts worried about Soviet technological breakthroughs. Others feared system-wide radar failure. A few raised a more troubling possibility, that the phenomenon was neither foreign nor mechanical. By 1953, the CIA entered the discussion. That year, the Robinson Panel was convened, a group of scientists tasked with evaluating unidentified aerial phenomena. Their conclusion was not that the objects were harmless, but that public interest itself was dangerous. The real threat, they argued, was mass hysteria and information overload. The recommendation was clear: reduce public attention. From that moment forward, the strategy shifted. Unexplained incidents would be downplayed. Ridicule would replace investigation. Secrecy would replace transparency. But the incidents did not stop. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, U.S. nuclear facilities reported intrusions. Missile officers described unknown objects hovering near launch sites. Radar systems malfunctioned during sightings. In some cases, missiles inexplicably shut down. Each incident was classified. Each one raised the same quiet question. If this was Soviet technology, why didn't it lead to escalation? And if it wasn't, what was it? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, multiple U.S. Navy vessels reported sonar contacts that behaved unlike submarines, descending rapidly beyond known depth limits, then vanishing. These reports were buried beneath the urgency of nuclear brinksmanship. The Cold War demanded certainty, and certainty was slipping. By the 1970s, technological advancement had outpaced Cold War paranoia. Satellites provided global surveillance. Digital systems reduced human error. Yet anomalies persisted, less frequent, more subtle, harder to explain. Pilots still saw pigs. Radar still glitched. Logs still contained words like unknown, unidentified, unresolved. What changed was how the government responded. Instead of denial, there was silence. Instead of explanation, there was classification. The Cold War eventually ended without nuclear war. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. Historians began digging. And what they found was not evidence of aliens, nor proof of secret enemy weapons, but something far more unsettling. A record of repeated encounters with phenomena that defied categorization. A pattern of uncertainty managed through suppression. A government choosing stability over truth. The United States did not lose the Cold War, but it never fully understood what it encountered along the way. And even now, decades later, some Cold War files remain sealed, not because they reveal an enemy, but because they reveal doubt. The kind of doubt that nations built on control cannot afford to admit.
At 12:34 a.m. on March 16, 1967, 10 nuclear missiles went offline simultaneously at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Each missile was housed in a hardened underground silo, protected against blast, electromagnetic pulse, and human error. Each had independent systems designed so that no single failure could disable more than one weapon. And yet, in the span of less than a minute, an entire flight of intercontinental ballistic missiles, each armed with a nuclear warhead, became inoperable. The launch control officers underground stared at their panels in disbelief. Warning lights cascaded across the board. Systems that had passed inspection hours earlier were suddenly unresponsive. Emergency procedures were initiated. Maintenance teams were dispatched. Higher command was notified. Above ground, security patrols reported something else. A glowing object hovered silently near the front gate of the facility. The official report made no mention of the object. It attributed the shutdown to a guidance and control system failure. The missiles were eventually brought back online. The incident was classified. The officers involved were instructed not to speak about it. They waited decades before they did. During the Cold War, America's nuclear arsenal was designed around a single principle: deterrence through certainty. The enemy had to believe that the missiles would launch if ordered. Anything that threatened that certainty, especially something unexplained, was a strategic nightmare. That is why incidents like Malmstrom were buried. But Malmstrom was not unique. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, similar events occurred at nuclear sites across the United States. At Minot Air Force Base, missile crews reported radar contacts hovering over restricted airspace. At Ellsworth, security personnel described silent objects maneuvering at impossible angles. In several cases, missile systems experienced unexplained malfunctions shortly after sightings. Internal Air Force memos reveal growing anxiety. Analysts debated whether the Soviets had developed a way to interfere with U.S. nuclear systems remotely, but intelligence assessments found no evidence of such technology. Soviet capabilities lagged behind American systems in several key areas. More importantly, Soviet archives later revealed that they were experiencing the same phenomenon at their own nuclear facilities. This realization deeply unsettled U.S. intelligence. If neither side was responsible, then the Cold War was being observed, perhaps even tested, by something outside the conflict. The CIA, which had initially treated unidentified aerial phenomena as a public relations issue, began quietly re-evaluating its position. Declassified documents show internal disagreement. Some analysts argued the incidents were natural phenomena poorly understood. Others believe the objects represented advanced surveillance technology of unknown origin. A small minority raised possibilities that had no comfortable place in military doctrine. Those voices were not encouraged. Instead, the policy of containment expanded, not of communism, but of information. By the late 1960s, reporting procedures had changed. Pilots were discouraged from filing UAP reports unless absolutely necessary. Radar anomalies were logged but rarely investigated unless they posed immediate threat. Missile crews were trained to focus on protocol, not interpretation. The goal was not to solve the mystery. The goal was to prevent distraction. During the Vietnam War, attention shifted overseas, yet even there, anomalies followed. Pilots over Southeast Asia reported lights pacing aircraft at high altitude. Radar contacts appeared over combat zones, then vanished. These incidents were typically blamed on enemy flares, weather, or stress. But stress does not disable radar. Stress does not shut down missiles. As the Cold War dragged on, a strange paradox emerged. Technology improved, surveillance became global, and yet the unexplained incidents became harder to dismiss, not because they increased, but because everything else became more reliable. When known systems behave predictably, anomalies stand out. In 1975, a wave of intrusions occurred at nuclear bases across the northern United States. Objects were reported hovering above missile fields for extended periods. Security teams were dispatched. Fighter jets were placed on alert. Missile systems experienced intermittent faults. Again, the public heard nothing. Inside the Pentagon, concern reached its peak. One internal briefing summarized the issue starkly. Unknown aerial phenomena demonstrate interest in strategic assets. Intent unknown, capability unknown, response options limited. That sentence alone explains decades of silence. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with an archive. When the Soviet Union collapsed, historians gained access to documents that mirrored American reports almost exactly. Soviet missile officers described glowing objects near silos. Radar operators logged impossible targets. Scientists debated explanations behind closed doors. Two enemies, divided by ideology, experienced the same mystery, and both chose secrecy. In the 1990s, as Cold War files were slowly declassified, a new generation of researchers began connecting dots. Patterns emerged across time, geography, and technology. The incidents clustered around strategic military assets. They involved interference without destruction, observation without engagement. Whatever the phenomenon was, it did not behave like a weapon. It behaved like a probe. By the early 21st century, the U.S. government began to soften its stance. Terms changed. Unidentified flying objects became unidentified aerial phenomena. Acknowledgement replaced denial. Navy pilots released footage of encounters. Pentagon officials confirmed investigations. But the Cold War files, those remain among the most heavily redacted, because they reveal something deeply uncomfortable, that for decades, during humanity's most dangerous standoff, something unknown moved freely through restricted airspace, interfered with the most powerful weapons ever built, and left without explanation. The Cold War was fought between nations, but it may not have been the only conflict taking place, and the story is still unfinished.